like scientific work, but presented to the public.
Yes.
It was something special. But it's also good to. I realized that it was the black community in Berlin, and then the press, not so much into the scientific community.
Yes.
And it's still a little bit odd because of the political.
So the museum, the people of the museum is not there?
Some maybe, but it's still kind of missing this introduction to the and it's also
like a side event.
Yeah, it was interesting. Interesting conference.
Sagst du mir Bescheid?
So many different contexts.
We'll be very happy because Misha was very busy with
Yeah.
We have to wait a little bit for the Zoom transmission. However that works.
You want to show something?
Probably not.
Yeah, it's better to read. Yeah.
I'll just read.
Keep it in focus. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. We don't. But tomorrow. Okay.
It's not as important to that tomorrow. So it's not a problem if you say.
I have one slide which I could show.
Yeah.
But not speak about but I'll show it tomorrow.
Yeah.
About this all-time census.
Yeah.
But she was reading on
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Einstein Forum and to our conference on the dignity of the dead. This event is hosted by Frédéric Keck, anthropologist and historian of philosophy, and by the Einstein Forum's very own Misha Gabovich, himself historian and sociologist. We will start off the conference tonight with a panel discussion about the question of dignity in dealing with human remains in museums and other collections, entitled Exposing the Dead. The panel discussion will be chaired by Frédéric, with contributions by the discussants Isabelle Reimann, Nilsson Stutz, and Aleksei Yurchak. Holger Stoecker, unfortunately, had to cancel on very short notice due to health issues. And a very warm welcome to you all. Great to have you with us. But of course, the discussion is not confined to the panelists. Later this evening, we will welcome comments and questions from all of you in the audience. And in fact, the audience is much larger than the number of people gathered in this room, as we welcome numerous viewers and listeners in the digital realm who are following our discussion via Zoom. You too are very welcome to take part in our discussion. If you have any comments or questions, please type them in using the Q&A function. Please do not use the chat. Use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Misha will read out your contributions for our panelists to respond. Talking about Zoom, I would like to recommend to everyone in this room to bring along their mobile telephones and headphones tomorrow, as there will be 2 contributions for which we will offer simultaneous translation into the English language, and we do so via Zoom, so you would have to listen with your very own telephone. If you experience any difficulty in gaining access to the stream, please talk to my esteemed colleague, Franziska Bomsky. She will help you. Another organizational matter which I would like to raise. Don't be surprised if we offer no lengthy introductions of our speakers. And please do not take this as a sign of disrespect to all the academic accolades and merits and long lists of publications, which are usually read out before academic presentations. It is not a sign of disrespect. We have assembled a brochure, a little booklet containing information on all our speakers and themes. I guess you all have one. For those who are listening and viewing us on Zoom, you can download a PDF file of that booklet from the website of the Einstein Forum. So, I promised no lengthy introduction. Therefore, without further ado, I will now hand over to Frédéric Keck to start the discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you all very much for being here.
Good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to welcome you for this roundtable exposing the dead, human remains on display, which opens the conference on the dignity of the dead at the Einstein Forum. I'm Frédéric Keck. I've co-organized this conference with Misha Gabrovich. Actually, he has done the biggest part of the work, and I want to thank him for bringing us together in this wonderful place. I have directed the research department of the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris, which is the main anthropology museum. And I have done some research on collections of human remains in Senegal, which I will present on Saturday. When Misha told me he wanted to organize a workshop on the dignity of the dead, which turns out to be so timely in a current context of COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine, I said I would like to have a discussion on the display of human remains, which has been a sensitive issue in European museums over the last 20 years. The Museum of Natural History in Paris, and I will talk about cases I know well, has exposed for 150 years the body of Saartje Bartman, a Khoisan woman from South Africa, where she was repatriated and buried in 2002. The Musée du Quai Branly was displaying human remains with tattoos from New Zealand or shrunken heads from South America because they were considered as cultural artifacts rather than biological samples and as documents of the life of the societies in which they had been collected. The museum repatriated heads of Maori chiefs in 2012 to New Zealand, where they are stored at the Te Papa Museum in Auckland, but not displayed, as a memorial where visitors can honor them. The International Council of Museums has recommended in 1986 that a special sensitivity toward objects containing human remains is needed. Exposing the dead seems to run counter to the general imperative to hide or bury the dead, which assumes that the dead should be placed in a space separate from the living where they can, as we say, rest in peace. It is interesting to contrast the exhibition of human remains in museums with other forms of display of dead bodies and ask what affects they are supposed to produce on those who watch them. Human societies have displayed dead bodies either as memorials, inspiring respect among the living, or as trophies, inspiring fear and awe. But it is quite recent that dead bodies have been exposed to satisfy curiosity and produce an objective knowledge on human anatomy and evolution as part of the Enlightenment sensibility. This curiosity has been questioned for the historical conditions of colonial violence that made it possible to display bodies far from the places where they live, and as if they came from a remote past. We must thus ask why these human remains have been exposed to the living and how they can be returned to the communities of the dead where they belong. So to discuss with these sensitive issues, we have the chance to gather 3 distinguished scholars who have worked and thought intensely about the treatment of the dead. So we were supposed to have Holger Stoecker, who is a historian at the University of Göttingen, who has taken part of the project Human Remains from Colonial Context in Göttingen University Collections, but we will think about him, and we have consulted his work, and we will mention them. Isabelle Reimann is a PhD researcher at the Humboldt University in Berlin, where she works on the provenance of colonial collections and questions the division between nature and culture. Liv Nilsson Stutz is a professor of archaeology at the Linnaeus University in Växjö in Sweden, specializing in the archaeology of death and burial. And finally, Aleksei Yurchak is a professor of anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley, where he works on the history of Soviet Communist project and on the post-socialist transformations in Russia and the former Soviet countries. So each of them will have 5 to 10 minutes of general comments, and we will have a roundtable discussion before opening the floor to the public. So without further ado, I leave the floor to Isabelle. Thank you for being there.
So thank you for having me here and for listening. I want to talk to one topic which really accompanied me in the last year when I was doing a survey, inventory about the human remains from colonial context in Berlin for NGO, which was from Decolonized Berlin. And this was the first time an over-institutional survey or inventory was made up about human remains in Germany. And so this ethical question of for who, which information for who should be available was with me from the beginning. I was also supervised by Paul Turnbull from Australia, and there the question of dealing with informations about human remains is a very sensitive topic, and therefore, this question went with me. And also one or two of my recommendations were that for further work and with dealing with the question of human remains from colonial contexts, we really need an advisory board with descendants, with repatriation practitioners, with people from the indigenous groups to which the remains belong or which they are linked to start the debate from the beginning and have this transparency not only in a digital form but really on a personal level. And I want to talk a little bit about this. And before I want to introduce you also to this current debate concerning over Berlin, like in all Germany, a national-wide inventory on human remains from colonial contexts in Germany. I want to share with you some takeaway messages I gathered when I observed the processes before the first repatriation of human remains in Saxony, which was conducted under the concept of rehumanization. And I want to tell you how human dignity was addressed there, referring to the title of the conference. So after 26 years of requests of letters to the museum from Hawaiian representatives who asked for information about the human remains from Hawaii, but also for the repatriation, the repatriation was finally carried out in 2017. And it was realized through this process of so-called rehumanization, which means an ontological change on the side of the community of acquisition, as I would say. It's like the museum management, the people dealing with the remains, being responsible, the politicians involved, and so on. To stop categorizing these human remains as objects and instead to understand on an institutional level human remains as the mortal remains of human beings, as relatives and not as in the first instance state property. And this process was really difficult. So it sounds very easy, but if you really look at the processes, there were so many different processes involved, like looking for the database, the insurance, the companies. Then there had to be some scientific recommendations, if it is still needed as research material, the remains, and so on. So there was really a lot of process going on, and in this process, it was not easy that this rehumanization was really worked out. So, but this process of rehumanization made it possible for the museum and the Free State of Saxony to apply human rights, above all the Article 1 of the German Basic Law on Human Dignity, to the dead. And it was also mentioned that the act of repatriation restored not only the dignity of the dead, but of the living descendants as well. So, as one of the delegates, Edward Halealoa Ayau, stated, the long negation of the request denied their humanity as descendants. So, caring for the dead is a core value for him and an expression of the Hawaiian humanity. So, he said at the ceremony, the repatriation helped us to be human again, which means to take care of our families. And also another delegate who was there then also said that the dehumanization of their ancestors also had a influence on the masters. So due to a master-slave dialectics, the dehumanization also dehumanizes the colonizer because they take themselves away out of the human family. So this process of rehumanization can be sort of also a bigger topic maybe, the question is also what means this rehumanization process for the decisions makers involved. And in my interviews with the museum workers as well as repatriation recipients, I found that each was speaking of a significant learning process and emotional participation. So the State Ministry of Saxony, she also, during the repatriation ceremony, she had to cry, and it was really emotional procedure, and also an intense experience for all of these people to rethink the categories of objects, of ownership, and also about their own responsibility in dealing with museum objects. So there was this rethinking process was a very profound one, I realized, which, for example, the Dr. Ackermann, who is the head of the Saxony State Art Foundation, Staatliche Kunstsammlung Dresden, sorry. She also, 1 year later, she also said this was one of the most important learning processes during the year. So it was kind of this learning process. And, but as I said before, there were so many bureaucratic procedures during the process of humanization and also repatriation that the objectification of human remains also continued and was reacted several times. And so therefore this process of rehumanization was undermined. And for the human remains, as for the museum workers, so I think it was very difficult to be and also to act human in this current museal administrative systems. So having this in mind, I think when we look now at how to deal with human remains on a more systematic, from colonial context, I mean, in a more systematic way into the German different states on national level, I think it's important also in light of decolonization to look and rethink this administrative logic of dealing with the human remains. And but still it is really important to have this overview of human remains, as it is also a demand since I don't know how much time that descendants also wants to know where the ancestors had gone, because in some parts of the world there's still the knowledge that some people have left or were killed also by the Germans and had to be brought to Germany. So there is still this traces, but they don't know where they came. So I mean, it's important to have this information, and also this 20-year process for requests from the Hawaiian side is kind of emblematic for this case. But until now, there is no cross-institutional inventory except this one for Berlin. But now I'm not sure how much I should include because Holger Stoecker is not here, and he wanted to talk about what provenance research mean in this regard. And maybe shall I take a little bit in, because from this question of the request of information to the possibility of giving answers from the museum, there's a big gap because the documentation is really low for different reasons. One reason is that in this process of making human remains as scientific preparate, like scientific specimens, they were re-individualized, and also for the collections of racial research, it was more important the category of the race as a whole than individuals. So this was also one reason why there is so less information on the individual left. And in this gap, this provenance research is the method, or the one method, I don't know, to really track the information. And in general, and this is what Holger Stoecker wanted to talk about, is because he was involved in the first big provenance research project for repatriation of the requested human remains from the big collection from the Lushan Sammlung in Berlin. And so this provenance research on human remains from colonial contexts became a topic around 2010 in response to these demands for restitution from Namibia, Australia, and New Zealand. And the provenance research is first and foremost reflects to the fact that this collection of museums and universities have shockingly little knowledge about the historical origins of the existing human remains. And one important concern also of provenance research, like I told before about the repatriation process, is the de-objectification and the rehumanization of the remains. So the ancestral remains held in the collection in the status of anthropological and anatomical objects are to be given back as far as possible an individual biography with names, dates, and social context, so that the descendants can be found and decide on the handling of how to deal with this. And the cooperation with the communities of origin is not only contributing to the validity of the results in a very practical way, but it was also prerequisite for the successful repatriation of the remains, and thus for the actual goal. So this is also one of this thesis that Holger Stoecker has conducted during his work. Because the actual goal is to ensure transparency about the historical context and to establish a new kind of relationship, and as Holger puts it, between the countries of origin and the German collection institutions. So this dialogue is already part of the process, and And in response to the debate, which were publicly debated in and also outside of institution, there was also in Germany this debate about to remove human remains from display. And this was, in many instances, the first thing which was done. For example, in Leipzig, when the new director came in and to take away the human remains, mainly from ethnographic museums. Now I talk only about ethnographic museums. And one example is in the Ethnological Museum in Berlin. In 2012, there were two toy moko removed from the public display. So it's heads from Maori, and the Museum of New Zealand was informed. And this was in particular because the volunteer Katharina Kepling and the restorer Diana Gabler there criticized the display of human remains and worked on this and also put a blanket on the display. So there was this discussion inside of the museum. And they recommended that initially a complete inventory must be made of all human remains at the museum, which at this time did not, and still it's in the making. So it's not really exactly clear how many human remains are in the ethnological museum. So now it's around 2,000 human remains which are in the ethnological museum, which also includes objects which were made from, which were parts are made with human remains, like hair or bones. And they were critical engaging also with Larissa Förster and Sarah Freund. On this time, there was the first recommendations for the care of human remains in museum and collections from the German Museum Association, written in 2013. And they said that it's really important to have this consultation also with indigenous people about what should be on display or not, but also about all this, the protocol of how to deal with the human remains. And I will say a quote by them. They said, "In the past, consultations with indigenous representatives have irregularly taken place at the Berlin Ethnological Museum, but not in a setting of equal responsibility and ownership. Establishing an infrastructure for this important part of the process should not remain an institutional responsibility, but needs to be shared on a national level." So also 10 years ago, almost, there was already this request to have something. For me, I think the most nearest thing is to really establish this advisory board so that from different museums people can go to some delegates and talk about this, and these delegates also have the possibility to give information back to their communities, because a lot of these debates, these questions have to be debated. Not only, there's not also the possibility that one delegate can decide. So it's discussions that has to be started sometimes first before there can be one conclusion. And in this this national responsibility of dealing with this human remains, now since 2019 started with these recommendations from the culture ministers and a group of people who wrote this Eckpunktepapier. How is it in English? I have to. Key issue paper on handling collections from colonial contexts. And the main course of action in this political space following these papers is in Germany centered on the aim of making the collections of colonial context digitally available. So a contact point was set up in October 2019, and it is commissioned to implement a so-called three-way strategy with the goal of setting up a central register for all collected items of all kinds from colonial contexts in German institutions. And on November 13th last year, a selected data set on colonial collections from 25 institutions were published in the German digital library, in the Deutsche Digitale Bibliothek. At first, the creators of this contact point stated from the beginning on that the form of digital records of human remains from colonial contexts would be examined and developed in cooperation with the countries of origin and societies of origin. So this was their official statement. However, in the information on human remains, some information was already published in November 2021 at the launch of this database. But in contrast to objects, they did not publish pictures, according to the debate during the last years, where this was mainly a concern that human remains should not display with pictures in this database. But still, criticism raised because they appeared also without any kind of disclaimer, so that if people look at the databases, they know that they can also be confronted with human remains, or also about saying something about how the information should be dealt with, or so on. And there was also the critique that it was together with object and animals' bones. So if you have for example, skull, then you have different animal skull and human skulls in one. So this was also one critique. And also they were presented with uncommented racist terms. And this was, I think, for me, it was the most problematic, because it was really racist terms that for a long time people said they don't want to have this words used for them, and so after this criticism, after a few days, the human remains were taken out of the list again, and in January this year, an expert meeting was conducted to rethink the digital survey on human remains in colonial collections, but it was again without our descendants or international participation. And in this talk, I was also invited, and many others, and so we also presented this idea of an advisory board there. Because I think really that the homemade problem of this lack of consent from descendants from all over the world when creating the collection should not be just not addressed. So if there's no consent on it, so this first act of acquisition is kind of legitimized. And there's, in this context, if you see the provenance researchers, it's really often very violent contexts of acquisition. So in military fightings, people were murdered and the human remains were brought to Germany, or in grave robberies and so on. So it's not that if you have such human remains, also they were used here often for, or in the end of the 90s, also for racist research, which was also used against the groups again, because it was also in the context of colonial and racist thinking structures. So I think that recognizing the authority of the descendants and ancestral communities in deciding how to deal with the remains of their ancestors also should include the full access to, and also the inclusion about the decisions of the publication of information that inform the narrative of ancestral memory. So, and this kind of sensitive information is a question. Should it be presented to descendants within a worldwide available database or only in a private Excel sheet or so on? And what information and which terms and so on? And there will be a very different kinds of answers also to very different people. And I think if we do not really start this process from the beginning on with this kind of debate and the information of the descendants, then there is this problem of only administering a problem, because the digital information is no aim in itself, and also no compensation for personal exchange and the direct proactive information of descendants and this collaborative working together, as also Holger Stoecker said before. So now, beginning of May, again, some 30 institutions in Germany were selected and asked by the contact point to provide information about human remains from colonial context. So this survey was started, but yet it remains uncertain who will have access to the information apart from this ordering group. And yeah, so I really hope that very soon this advisory board is also built up to discuss this survey and how to go on and how this information is also controlled and curated, and in this aim of restoring human dignity for the remains, but also the descendants and also the acquisition community. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So we have talked about human remains in anthropology museums, where the descendants can be found, and through oral history the stories can be retraced, and they can be associated to the repatriation. And now we will talk about archaeology research, where that goes to a more remote past. And so I leave the floor to Liv.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for including me in this panel on this very current and important issue. The debate about human remains in museums and research is not new, but I have a feeling that there is a new push in the general debate right now that has made it even more kind of both current and central to the debates in more places than it previously was. So thank you so much for including me. And I will actually talk a little bit beyond archaeology, because as you will see, I'm really interested in stepping away from the categories that we tend to hide behind, whether it is anatomical collections, archaeological collections, colonial collections, historical collections, and so on, and try to explore the topic of ethics and human remains from the basic category of what that actually is. And as a point of departure, I will center a few central dichotomies and also paradoxes that I see in the ways in which we can conceptualize human remains. Human remains are not neutral. I argue that they are situated on a scale between scientific objects and lived lives. So they are subject objects, if you want. This scale, how we perceive them, to what degree they are lived lives, humans, or objects of science, it can shift quite a bit. When we think about how human remains are perceived by different stakeholders, things that can appear to be quite banal have consequences. Their state of preservation, their level of fragmentation, what bones are represented in what we see. I think that a lot of people respond to preserved specimen, anatomical specimen, including soft tissue for example, more than to cremated remains from the Iron Age. A crania fragment, especially if it contains orbits or teeth, are more recognizable as human compared to a rib or, say, body fluids that are also human remains, blood, semen, sweat, hair. Another thing that gets that or that scale sliding is the history of the collection. Under what circumstances were these specimens collected, or were these people collected? How much we know about them. I think Isabelle gave us really great examples right now on how provenance research rehumanizes sometimes, including for the researcher or the curator, and increases the level of human or lived life on this scale. So it moves. But the level to which we understand human remains in museums and in research is also dependent on the general debate. And right now I think we are in a moment where we are prompted to see the humanness more and more in these human remains, because that's where the cultural debate is inviting us to go. Sometimes there is a paradox in this sliding of the scale that builds with the research. As you mentioned, the provenance research, which is one that allows access, allows you to handle the remains and do research on them, and treat them as a kind of scientific source at least, then increases their level of humanity to the point of maybe you feel uncomfortable of having done the research in the first place. So these things move, and I think that's important. Another dichotomy is the biocultural nature of human remains. Humans are biocultural beings. We are shaped by our biology, but we are also and equally shaped by culture. The two influence one another through our human evolution, but also through human diversity across contemporary populations today. So we are both. And when we study human remains, the stories that are revealed are always embedded also in the human history, in the cultural dimension. You mentioned how human remains are sometimes placed in databases next to animal remains. And unless you're a post-humanist, in which case that might be completely okay, this is the kind of distinction that can become very problematic because human remains are so rich of human stories. And from an archaeological or bioarchaeological point of view, and this is not to say that we should always do this kind of research, because I don't think that we always should do this kind of research. But what this kind of research in some cases can reveal are the untold and unwritten stories of marginalized people, of structural violence, of food insecurity, of oppression, of structural violence, like the medical practices that collected these specimens/people in the first place. So this again is a paradox. And so this double nature also makes them valuable for research. It makes them interesting, but it also makes them vulnerable. So here is another pairing that I think is really important to think about. And when we look at things like best practices for repatriation or legislation that is regulating repatriation, return, reburial, for example, they often tend to, when there's not a problem, when there is not a conflict, they work really well. But when there is a conflict, that's when we start to see what they don't always cover, or who they don't necessarily always include. There is a lot of holes in the mesh of the legislative protective umbrella that is supposed to kind of regulate these processes. We could talk about that more in detail, but suffice it now to say that the the differences in terms of whenever there is a conflict, the distinction that is made is often like, what is it that we want to protect? Different stakeholders want to protect different things. Descending communities and others might want to protect the humanity of these people, while sometimes, not always, the scientific community want to protect their scientific value. That's where the conflict lies. So, can we protect both? Should we want to protect both? These are questions that we need to address. Today, we are in a moment of a post-colonial critique and calls for decolonization. And I think that they have been incredibly transformative for this whole debate. And I believe that human remains, of course, these calls for decolonization are more widely applicable to institutions of power and institutions of learning. And calls for repatriation include other things than simply human remains. They also include material culture. But human remains, I believe, have a very forceful place in these debates because they embody a lot of the colonial violence because of the ways in which they were taken, almost always unethically, often illegally, often through violence or theft or undue pressure. And the calls for repatriation of human remains are significant because they relate immediately to concepts such as right to culture and right to difference. And they destabilize the Western hegemony, if you want, in this sense. Call into question the hegemony of imposing structures of knowledge onto the rest of the world. Human remains are also intimately connected to race science, often in these collections. And that, of course, makes the dimension of violence and dehumanization even more tangible when it comes to these collections. So, when we look at human remains from this perspective, in particular human remains that that come to museums and centers of research from a colonial context, they are deeply problematic. They used to be an asset. Now they have become a burden. They have become a burden to the point that they are bad for business. I think this is also a really important thing to consider. To what extent is this work toward reconciliation, repatriation, sometimes also self-serving on behalf of institutions? I think it's not to say that it shouldn't happen. I just think it's interesting to raise this question. They have become a burden. So what's the way forward? I believe there is only one way forward, but the challenge will be on how to do it right. But I believe that with colonial collections, if we break them away from all other human remains, collections of human remains that are in museums, it's probably one where the decisions are among the easier to sort out in terms of the ethics of it. It can always pose different kinds of challenges in terms of determining the right place that these things should go back to, and so on. But I think that in terms of the ethics, it's not as complicated. But they are only one category of human remains that are in museums and in research. And not all, when we think about things like provenance and stakeholders and identified stakeholders and understanding how the human remains should be treated, especially when we look at anatomical collections, we have many human remains that will never really fall under the categories that are currently formulated as worthy of protection. And I think that's an issue for the future, and perhaps also, or very very likely, so also, it may not become such an urgent issue, but as an archaeologist myself who work with human remains, I find it really, really important to extend this, to slide the scale toward humanity also when it comes to very old remains. What decisions should be made then in terms of addressing that is difficult, but I do think that we can't. There is something very problematic in the way in which we today categorize different kinds of collections. It's pragmatic, but it's not good enough. Considering that not all human remains will be included in the current debates that we're having, I tend to favor a process forward that I call an ethics of care, which I liken a little bit to the way we talk about ethics of care in medicine. You have your patients in your care. You have to care for them, no matter where they come from or what they can do for you. There is a tendency, sometimes in this debate, to quote unquote get rid of things that are not scientifically valuable and so on. Our disciplines, archaeology, anthropology, medicine, etc., collected these human remains. So we need to bear the burden of that. And when I say that, it doesn't mean that I feel like we need to bear the burden in the sense of holding on to it, but we cannot sweep it under the carpet and clean it out too quickly, which is sometimes the kind of approach I see mentioned. We need to take the responsibility, do the work, and put in the resources it takes for us to handle this in the right way. I predict that, and this is where I will finish, I predict that the critique that has taken form within the post-colonial debate, that has formed from the political and emotional and religious engagement with the structural violence and injustice carried out by colonial violence with regard to human remains, I believe that critique will expand to other groups that have also been caught up in structural violence in our history. I am thinking about perspectives of gender and class and disability in anatomical collections in particular. I think that the political discourses are, in terms of seeing the violence and calling for justice, are quite transferable. And I think that we need to be prepared to engage with these collections as well and the stakeholders that claim them. And to do that, we need to be prepared. We need to listen, as you said, but we also need to to destabilize the categories that we have in place and expand the humanity of human remains to additional categories of human remains in our collections. Thanks.
Thank you. So one of the questions for museums today is, should we remove the mummies that we watch with trouble when we visited the museums? And we will now talk about a country where the central political figure has been mummified.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I wanted to thank the Einstein Forum for the invitation, and Misha and Frédéric in particular for inviting me to this conference and to this panel today. And I should say, I will be speaking about Lenin's body. It's not mummified, and this is a very important distinction. I'll explain why, especially tomorrow. It's often called a mummy, and this is a bit of a political jargon which has a particular political significance when they call it a mummy. But the scientists who maintain it always say this is not a mummy. Why that is important, we'll talk about later. but it is important. So I had a long flight, and I just took advantage of it and decided to write some notes. I will read them, okay? I hope it's okay. Okay, so Lenin's body has been displayed in the mausoleum on the Red Square for almost 100 years, 98 years to be precise. The display of this body has some connection to the display of bodies in ethnographic, anthropological, anatomical, historical museums, other collections, and also in various memorials and monuments. But there are also very major differences in this case, and some of them are quite obvious. So first, the mausoleum on the Red Square is not a museum, and it is not quite a memorial or a shrine either. It is a very unique site. Second, Lenin's body is both the remains of a concrete person, but also an artifact that has been actively constructed and reconstructed. This body is regularly re-embalmed, resculpted, fixed, tested, analyzed, and so on by the scientists of the mausoleum lab. So a mummy is something which dries up, is stiff, and doesn't quite look like a person. And this body is all the criteria which are directed at the scientific work to which this body is subjected are the criteria which don't allow it to get mummified. So it has to be a non-mummy. The original preservation of this body in 1924 was an act that marked the revolution and what was believed to be a radical transformation of the world. This body is a very complex and contradictory political symbol, therefore. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, this body's original political meaning has become unhinged. Today, this body is still on display. You can still visit it on the Red Square. And the scientific lab still continues to maintain it, although the size of the lab and the amount of research that is conducted connected to this body have shrunk considerably. So this body is not only a peculiar historical object and not only human remains, it is also a unique scientific object. In fact, a lot of interesting science has developed as a result of maintaining this body and conducting research connected to it. I'm currently finishing a book which is basically centered on this body, but talks about a lot of other things around it. And part of the research which I did, in addition to historical research, which is obviously necessary here, was an ethnography of the lab itself, which is quite difficult to do because it's pretty secretive, but it's possible. And so I've been interacting with the scientists, and they have done so much incredible science there, which is mind-boggling. Okay, 6. In the past 30 years, there have been many heated debates about what the fate of this body should be. Should it continue to be preserved and displayed? Should it be buried in the ground? Should its preservation be considered a scientific experiment that has the right to continue? What is the ethics behind all of these perspectives? And also, how ethical was the preservation and display of that body in the first place? So it's important to consider the context of the revolution to begin with, right, and the 1920s as well. What was the motivation? Because Lenin died in 1924. What was the motivation of the revolutionary leaders who decided to preserve and display Lenin's body in 1924? What was the popular attitude to this project at that time? And what were Lenin's own wishes regarding his own burial? Without a doubt, Lenin would have been appalled had he known that his body would be preserved and publicly displayed. This act completely violated his revolutionary Marxist aversion to individual cults and to the idea that history is made by great men. It has been also argued that the preservation and display of Lenin's body directly violated his personal will. It has been alleged that he wanted to be buried next to his mother in St. Petersburg. Well, now we know that this claim is false. Lenin didn't leave any personal will on the matter and never spoke about his desired final resting place. But even if he did, his revolutionary comrades could have easily decided that his personal wishes in this matter were of secondary importance. They saw Lenin's body as something that was not his personal possession. By preserving and displaying his body in the mausoleum on the Red Square, they were placing not a person, but the embodied Leninism in the heart of the future liberated humanity. And they considered this person-oriented ethics to be bourgeois liberal ethics, and therefore they went against it. They also felt that since Lenin shared their perspective on future human history, he would ultimately understand their decision and would agree that it is not necessary it is not necessarily anti-Marxist and unethical. However, with time, the dominant opinion about this body changed. This happened especially in the post-Soviet period, when the project of building communism under the banner of Lenin was abandoned. In today's post-Soviet context, Lenin's body acquires new meanings, which are multiple and conflicting. And the body has found itself in the center of several heated public debates. Attitudes towards this body and its display in the former Soviet Union have been split between several positions. And to simplify, I will just outline the major ones. So some people argue that this body is an evil emblem of a criminal regime, and therefore it should be publicly disgraced as the body of a criminal. Others consider this body a sacred symbol of the heroic revolutionary past, which should be treated with honors and remain in the mausoleum on the Red Square. And the third argue that this body is a neutral symbol of national history, neither good nor bad, and as such it can be kept in the mausoleum, or it can be buried in the ground, or it can be moved maybe to a different location like any monument could. The position of those who oppose the body tends to be articulated from the liberal or nationalist standpoints, both of which are deeply anti-Soviet. In these views, Lenin's body is associated not with the revolution and a dream of the future and future liberation, but with totalitarian oppression and Soviet imperialism. Attacks on Lenin's monuments in many post-communist countries are a good example of this perspective on Lenin as a symbol. It has been even argued that until Lenin's body is buried in the ground, democratic reforms in Russia will continue to fail. It is as if Lenin's body continues to exert some powerful negative energy, which undermines all attempts to democratize. Those people who oppose this negative argument often share more left-leaning politics and often have a more nuanced view of history. They stress, for example, that during his time, Lenin was an important and even sacred figure for millions of people who supported the revolution. To that revolutionary generation, preserving and displaying Lenin's body as the leader of the revolution was meaningful and ethical. These people, goes the argument, are our ancestors, and we must take their view seriously and respect them. This argument, as you see, is somewhat reminiscent of today's decolonial approach to cultural artifacts and human remains. According to this view, protecting Lenin's body from attacks is equated with defending not the state and its oppressive regime, but a unique revolutionary culture and identity of the people who lived in the early Soviet times. The third position argues for treating Lenin's body as a neutral historical artifact, as I mentioned, and for treating the mausoleum as a historical monument, or even turning it into a museum. Most of the Russian government rhetoric in the past 20 years tends towards this third neutral position. The government tries to argue that there is nothing unique or unusual about the preservation and display of Lenin's body. One way of doing this, making it not very unique, of neutralizing it, is to compare with other bodies which existed in different places throughout history. A few years ago, for example, the president was asked whether he agreed that having an unburied corpse in the center of the country violated Russian religious traditions. And his response was that this body did not violate any traditions because, in fact, quote, uncorruptible bodies of saints are routinely displayed in the Orthodox and Catholic monasteries. The preservation of Lenin's body simply continues this long-standing practice, he argued. Although in the Soviet case, of course, the regime undeniably used this tradition in its own interests. But the comparison of Lenin's body with a religious relic caused a public scandal. Members of different political groups that usually fiercely oppose one another, such as anti-Western nationalists, pro-Western liberals, and members of the Orthodox Church, as well as members of the Communist Party, were for once united in their outrage with this statement. Occupying different political positions, they nevertheless argued in unison that Leninism was that Lenin was an enemy of religion, that Lenin was an enemy of religion, and therefore Lenin's body cannot be compared to a religious relic. The Russian Orthodox Church argued that the body of a martyr can be considered a sacred relic only if the site of its burial is associated with miracles, and no miracles have been observed next to Lenin's body. Russian nationalists were outraged by the comparison of the Orthodox Russian saints, whom they worship, with the leader of the Bolsheviks, whom they call the executioners of the Russian people. And communists condemned this comparison because Lenin was a materialist and an enemy of religion, and therefore drawing a parallel between his sacred body and some backward religious symbols is unethical. However, the point of that official comparison was not to describe Lenin as a religious saint or represent his body as a relic, but to suggest that Lenin's body is not unique and that human history is full of similar bodies. A broader point was to argue that Soviet history was not unique or criminal, but part of normal human history. Therefore, the only reasonable historical approach is to leave Lenin's body where it is now. When asked whether the government has any plans to bury Lenin's body, the press secretary of the president's office responded, "At the present moment, this topic is not on the agenda. It is irrelevant." And the final point, this attempt to normalize Lenin's body has acquired an interesting twist in the rhetoric of the scientists who continue to maintain, fix, and re-embalm this body today. It's maintained all the time. It's a very dynamic method of preservation, so it's not left there once and for all, but constantly it's very soft and fresh and so forth. They argue that this preservation for the past 100 years should be seen as an important scientific experiment. With the director of the Mausoleum Lab, when the director of the Mausoleum Lab was asked whether, in his opinion, Lenin's body should be removed from the mausoleum, he replied, "Whether it is removed or not is a political question, and it doesn't matter. But in either case, we must not allow the course of this great scientific experiment to be interrupted." In this scientific opinion, Lenin's body may be taken from the mausoleum and no longer publicly displayed, but instead of burying it, it should be transferred to the laboratory where the preservation and research around it should continue. In fact, some scientists of the lab also pointed out that their unique method of preservation and their unique understanding of dead flesh allowed them to save and restore many ancient bodies found by archaeologists, including the famous 2,000-year-old body of the Altai princess, which was actually preserved and embalmed in that Lenin lab. So this is a connection between the ancient princess and Lenin, although the method which has been used in both cases is quite different. Thank you.
Thank you, Aleksei. So I now open the floor to questions to the three speakers.
Oh, of course. Yeah, there is one at this one.
There's a question on the... So we'll take question here on the mic.
Yeah, I don't.
So we have a question on Zoom from Irina Skokina, who is joining us from Lviv via Zoom and who is going to be talking tomorrow, which is for Isabelle. So she writes, when the human remains were removed from the exhibitions in Germany, what stayed in the exhibitions instead? How is the practice of the colonial handling of human remains recognized in the exhibitions? And is there a risk that the removal will result in silencing the issue?
In silencing?
In silencing the whole question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's very different to different museums. So I can talk now for the Leipzig Grassi Museum. With this idea of this rehumanization and the work of Birgit Scheps-Brettschneider, who was worked there, she found it really important to have a place inside the museum to work together with descendants that is not in the storage or in the archive. And so now, since some weeks, more or less, or some months, there is one room which is kind of memorial room, where also candles can be in and so on. And there's also a small exhibition about repatriation around. So in this case, it's kind of the museum's idea also to take this topic as an educational and also identity of their own institution process. And yeah, I'm really looking forward also how it is reworked also. So I had the possibility to go together with a delegation from Tanzania to this place also, because I also make provenance research to human remains from Tanzania, or from the nowadays Tanzania. And it was Mnyaka Sororumboro, who was since the 80s, he's looking after a head of one Chaga chief who was brought to Germany, so he's looking for a very long time, and lots of times the museums were only closed and not open for him. And he was really for him it was really new, and he was really very thankful for this possibility to see the heads, the skulls, in a humanized manner, so with flowers and candles and so. This was for him it was really very important. But this I can only say now for Leipzig, and I think you may talk about how it is in the Cape Ronny.
So in the Cape Ronny there are still some human remains on display, but they are ornamental. When they returned the Maori heads, there was actually a ceremonial where they were rehumanized. The choice made by the museum is also to keep some objects from Papua New Guinea that are cultural artifacts.
So I actually have some questions of my own, and I guess they are, in a sense, both for Liv and for Isabelle, because they concern the relationship between the human remains and the descendants of these people. Because, in a sense, the figure of the descendant seems to be quite important in deciding what is the ethical thing to do, right? And coming from the study of commemoration, I'm very interested in sort of the dynamic of perception among descendants. So I'm wondering, in your case, Isabelle, would you say that in the cases that you've looked at of repatriation or demands for repatriation, that the descendants always knew that there were these remains and they had always been waiting to be able to restitute them? Or are there cases where people weren't really aware of this, and then there was a point because they became interested in their family history, or because they gained the technological means or new sources of information emerged, when suddenly they realized, oh, wait a moment, there are these objects that are really parts of my ancestor that are stored in a museum collection in some faraway country. And then the part for Liv is, so since you said that you would also like to apply these ethical rules to very old human remains, does it matter whether there are known descendants alive today who can lay a claim to these body parts? And is there, is it a question of chronology? So is there a point where, so many generations down, we feel that somehow the ethics change? Or is it a matter of knowledge? There's kind of an unbroken chain of knowledge that these are our descendants? Or would you say that none of this really matters because there's kind of a universal rule about the ethics of dealing with these human remains? And then finally, also, is there a debate about whether, so for example, Frédéric just mentioned this ceremony. So, obviously the ceremonies and the burials are performed by people alive today, right? Including descendants of the people that we're keeping in collections. But is there a debate about whether the ceremonies and the burial practices that they're advocating today are actually the same as what these people, when they were alive, would have expected to be subjected to, right? So just as Aleksei was saying, in the case of Lenin, I mean, there is a reference in that debate to Lenin's own wishes. And there are different positions on what those wishes might have been. Is this something that we're also finding in these debates where, I'm fantasizing, but some historian might say, well, these people in Tanzania today, they might think that this is a respectful way of burying their ancestors. But in fact, we know from historical research that the ancestors themselves would have wanted something completely different.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I start with the first question. Yeah, I think in many instances, the people in the colonies, the colonized people did not know about the human remains that was taken away. There's, for example, a lot of evidence also in letters, for example, that scientists and also colonial officers, they went in the nights to collect the human remains from graves and so on, to not be seen. And it was also, in many cases, there was also said, there was a wish, for example, from Felix von Duchamp to have big series of skulls from Ugogo in Tanzania, but the person, the doctor, the military doctor there said, no, we cannot bring one because it will be a security issue, because it's really a no-go to take human remains from here. I can only bring one, for example. So there is this evidence in the sources that it was often also without people knowing about it. And then there's also, for example, the missionaries. There was a talk by Thomas Ruland. He was looking at the human remains brought from missionary society, and there, for example, it was also not talked openly about this. Also, some people in this network, they gained money, but they didn't refer to this work openly. And then there's also some, for example, from Paul Turnbull, who in the Australian context, where there was the evidence that an anthropologist brought human remains back, but for the society where this anthropologist was, this was very new information. He was in the oral history, he was as a friend, we saw it as a friend, and then later on they saw that he also brought human remains. So I think this is, it's in many cases not so that people know about the human remains. And I think to the last question only, I'm really very sure and very aware of the fact that it's really difficult to say who is the descendant and not, also in the post-colonial states, and where the nation state is kind of still the process of building more homogeneous nation state is going on, when in the same time there are the dynamics for indigenous rights and sovereignty of different people. So the question is really difficult, and also it can change a lot after generations. So I think there's never, as it's wonderfully presented, there is not one solution for always. But I think really what is important for me personally, from this decolonial point of view, that it's not the colonial institutions who can decide who is the right owner and what is the right treatment to do, and who should the repatriation be made or not, because in case of the objects are preserved or not also. So that this authority, which a long time the West and the scientific community took for themselves as speaking for all the world, I think this is really something that we should stop. So, and then it is this complexity, and I think this is the problem, this part of the problem, but to take it seriously and to look for values underneath and debates of how to deal with this, I think this is the work we have to do, and what Liv said so nicely, that may lead also to kind of rethinking being human also in different other instances.
All right. So, does it matter whether there are descendants? From the kind of institution or archaeological or curator point of view, if there are descendants that you administratively recognize as descendants, it's a lot easier if there are those types of descendants, right? Because descendants can be a lot of different things. So if we're talking about known individuals with established family relationships that claim the remains of their ancestor, it's then it's an easier thing to decide on. I will give an example. In the 1850s, there was an uprising of the Sami religious group in the north of Norway, in Kautokeino. And it ended with a death sentence to two men who were considered to be leaders. And they were beheaded, and their heads were taken to the university in Oslo, and the bodies were buried. And the crania remained in institutions, although one was traded to Copenhagen in exchange for two Inuit. That's also a common thing. But when the family started to call for the return of these, in the beginning there was resistance, but over the course of negotiations, like this is the kind of case that becomes incredibly difficult to question. And so both, in those cases, both those crania were returned and reburied. So that would be an example of yes, there are descendants that are known individuals, known descendants, etc. But when we're talking about these things, descendants can be so much more. And when we talk about descendants, as I imply from your question, that's our definition of descendants. You can have cases of people identifying as descendants, and for them that is real, and that is the case. So when we look at a quite far-reaching and regulated process like they have in the United States, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, affiliation is determined on a range of different types of evidence, including traditional knowledge, including geography, but also including family relationships and so on. You just put all of the evidence in and you kind of look at it. And so in those cases, a descendant can be so much more, and they can be felt as very close. So if we take another concrete example there, the case of the Kennewick man, that was the human remains were washed out of a riverbank in Washington State in the 90s. And it was determined to be 9,600 or so years old. So a Paleolithic human being. But it was claimed for repatriation by 5 local tribes that formed a consortia, a collaboration. And they claimed that this is our land, we've always been here, this is our ancestor. And there you come into this, what we could get at of saying well, that's your understanding, and the understanding from the scientific side is that people have moved a lot since then, and cultures change and so on. And so that's the conundrum. And if you want to take that criticism a little bit farther, you can say, well, a lot of the criticism that is waged against kind of Western science is that they view indigenous peoples as never changing, as always staying in one place and being the quote-unquote people without history. But in this case, that argument is used to assert this claim. So that would be a case where they say, it doesn't matter, we know. And then we have to decide. Then it's a lot more difficult, because then we have to decide what we're going to do. And in this case, the remains eventually were reburied, but there was a very long process. But what this means is that repatriation is a matter of transfer of ownership. It is about seizing the control over the decisions, the identifications, the right to decide what's going to happen. That's what it is, and that's why it is a material transaction, but it is also about allowing, it's about reconciliation, it's about healing and all that kind of stuff, but it is also about giving people back the right to write their own history and determine their own destiny and the bodies of their dead. So it's a transfer of ownership, and when you make that transfer of ownership, you can no longer have any, you don't have a say of what's going to happen. I mean, you can negotiate these things, but it doesn't have, like you said, like it's not something that you can impose on the transition. And that's when it becomes complicated, when the scientists, on the one hand, and the descending community feel very differently about what's going on. And I think we need to talk about these difficulties too, and not only talk about the wonderful, happy stories. Because it's when it becomes complicated that we can really also try to find new solutions forward. Because there is going to be these problems. And that gets to the issue of correct ritual practices. Of course not in the sense of what a historian might say, necessarily. I mean, sometimes, yes. First of all, there is no proper burial in any, I guess, indigenous people's repertoire that's old to handle this particular kind of nuts need of, it's not like there is an arsenal of ritual responses to getting ancestors back from museums in faraway countries. So there isn't. But even so, like what we see, for example, it's something that I had a really big problem with in the beginning. And I saw images of reburial ceremonies in Alaska with really old Native American remains. And they were, and there is a Russian Orthodox priest presiding over the ritual. And to me, and it's not my business, it's not my business. But to me, that felt wrong, because I was thinking like, well, Christianity, hello, colonization, right? But this is, so that happens a lot. But it's kind of irrelevant, I guess, because these rituals are for the living at this point in time. And that's also something that we probably, sitting on the other side, can't really have a say in, and to some extent that is less of a challenge to me than when you have these issues of finding the right recipient. Because you said, and I understand what you mean when you say it's not our responsibility, but it is to a point. A lot of international laws, for example, provide processes for transfer or repatriation between nation states, because that's how international law usually operates. But you can have a nation state that oppresses a minority or an indigenous people, and they can negotiate a return of these, whether it's artifacts or human remains, and there you could really ask yourself, is this the proper recipient? But they are right now protected by law. So I do think that as long as these human remains are under the purview of the museum, I think the museum still needs to take this responsibility seriously. I think it would be a very big mistake to just step back and say, this is really hard and we've been really bad, so you deal with it. Because I think that is not taking responsibility. It does not. I'm not saying that we shouldn't repatriate, but I'm saying that to just concede and say it's not our responsibility could be unethical as well. Yeah. And just what you said, how old they are, from your perspective as an archaeologist, I don't think that an ethics of care necessarily need to always mean repatriation either. But I think that we need more professional ethics in how we handle human remains, no matter what they look like and where they're from. They shouldn't be, we should have standards in our museums and in our research that doesn't distinguish. And they should live up to the highest standards of respecting the human remains so that they could be, even if they're 5,000 years old, you know.
There's one question here.
Can I add a little bit to this?
Sorry.
I'm sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you. Just wanted to quickly add, even though Misha's question was not directed to me personally, but I thought about a similar issue. From the example which I gave with this political body, I think one more perspective sort of becomes visible, and namely, when we think about indigenous groups, we think about ancestors, about lineages, especially in the colonial context and colonization, we tend to think about groups in ethnic and cultural terms. But there are also groups which can be thought of in political terms, which are not ethnically, culturally defined necessarily. So the groups which might see, like in my case, Lenin's Body, this whole idea of the revolution as through some ancestorial prism might not be the indigeneity groups, which is like a very, our tendency is to see sort of through this Western prism onto the people without history, as you said, and giving them history back. But this is not the case in this particular example, which we should also consider in similar terms, right? So a certain kind of ancestorial connection to Lenin. This is our ancestor, this is our ethical obligation and so forth, can be understood very much in political terms and not at all in terms of ethnic, cultural possession and belonging and who has the property and who has the right to have the property. And I think that probably that corrective sort of gaze might also be helpful for other bodies as well. That's what I wanted to add.
There is a distinct, if I may fill in, there is a distinct danger in the ways in which these discourses tend to become essentializing.
Yeah.
And I think that it's just something that needs to be part of the discussion. Essentializing and all of these arguments like right to culture and right to difference can be used for, when we talk about them, when we talk about these issues, we tend to think about them as progressive, but they might just as well be deployed for very reactionary agendas as well. And so these are just things to, I think these debates are mature enough to withstand that kind of critical scrutiny as well.
But I would even add to this. I think I completely agree with you. I'm sorry if we have started a little bit of discussion already, but we will go back to it. I would even add to this that what we see as progressive often tends to have its legs in liberalism. With a body like Lenin, with this communist project, it was precisely against that kind of idea of indigeneity that they were doing the revolution. So to think about this, who has the right to possess, the right to property, all those things for them were anathema. They were questioning that, and I think that's even more progressive in some ways. It's a different form of progressive attitude towards history, towards lineages, towards culture. So our division of the world into global north, global south, for example, is also kind of a liberal division. It's very problematic. It used to be three worlds, and now it's this. And for example, what's happening now in Ukraine, Russia, is completely invisible through that prism, global north, global south. That history of the Soviet world doesn't fit into that binary. So I think the cultural and sort of ethnic ways of thinking about property and thinking about rights has that problem as well.
You want to add something?
Maybe you may.
Thank you very much to all of you. My question comes in two parts, and the second part may sound frivolous, but it is a serious question of inquiry. The first part, do the institutions, the holding institutions, museums or collections, initiate provenance research in cases where there was no restitution request? And if so, and that's, here comes the not frivolous part, please don't misunderstand. If so, once identified, have descendant groups said, oh no, thank you, keep that stuff. I don't want to deal with that skull, thank you very much. Do you know cases of that?
Yeah, that has happened. I think the best case is the one from the American Museum of Natural History with the remains of an Inuit man. That it's been chronicled in a book called "Give Me My Father's Body." It was a curator. I don't know. I don't remember if it's Boas. Is it Franz Boas? Is one of the curators at the museum at the time who receives a delegation of two Inuit men, and one of them dies while he's in New York, and he has his son with him, and they stage a burial for in the museum grounds, but they actually take the remains and put them in the collection, and then much later. This story kind of comes out, and the museum really wants to repatriate these remains because it's post-NAGPRA, I believe, when this happened. So, it's very damning, like very problematic for the brand of a museum to have the story hanging over them. And the story I've heard is that the Inuit community says, thanks, but no thanks. We don't want this. We don't really care that much about this, or we don't want to receive it. So that's kind of the best story. But you could have potentially, I think museums are obligated in some cases, at least in the US, and I think increasingly with these new kind of provisions and regulations to find out what they have and identify. I know we have collections like that in Sweden where it's considered the job of the museum to make this provenance research, because we can't wait for descending communities to know, like to call all museums all over the world and ask them, and they will say, we don't know, but we can look. What does it look, you know? So the museum does the research and then makes the information available, but then you can have communities that don't want the remains back because they're too dangerous to receive, or they're not that interested in them. And with the repatriation of with the negotiation of the ethnographic and anthropological collections from Greenland with Copenhagen, it was initiated by Copenhagen. They divided everything up in 50-50, but the ownership of the human remains is Greenland, but they have deposited it in Copenhagen because they want it to be available for research, and they don't have the facilities. So there are all sorts of possible.
But that raises an interesting ethical conundrum, I think, because if restitution is refused on the part of the descendant, who has the ethics of care then, and how to exercise it? If the museum has to keep it because it's not wanted, what to do with it then?
It's common that even if a descending community doesn't want to return things because maybe they are too dangerous or too powerful or something, that they may have an agreement with the museum of how the remains should be treated in the museum. So they can have an agreement of what should be stored together and who is responsible and so on. So that's quite common. And I think it's a great way to build trust and relationships with one another, to collaborate around these things. Not only repatriations, but also in cases when repatriation is not carried out, to nourish a relationship that continues to grow.
Yeah, I also want to contribute to your question. I want to So I also know one instance from Santi Hitorangi and Evelyn Huki, who also made a comment on my survey, and they come from Rapa Nui, and this is, the German word is Osterinseln, so that belongs to the Chilean state, but they themselves see that they are kind of colonized still by the Chilean state. So, for example, for them, repatriation, if it's to a museum in Chile, would be not what they want to. So, in this case, the repatriation would not be accepted by them, as they told me. And then there's also a very big issue also maybe that we can also address, as you said, also Liv. So yeah, it's a responsibility, and it needs resources, and repatriation also needs a lot of resources. So nowadays it's still so that some delegates have to collect the money in their communities to bring people to Germany, for example, to make here ceremonies, also to bring back the dead people. And I think this is really something we really have to work on, because it cannot be that museums repatriate, but don't take also responsibility to bring them back, and so that the descendants have to ask in their communities for donations and so on, and only then can the repatriation can happen. So I think this is also something that really has to be addressed also, and found maybe some funding that also can, not only the museum now can ask for money for provenance research, but the descendants, for example, cannot really in Germany ask for support, and the post-colonial nation states not always have the money for this cultural programs also in the same manner. So I think this is really an important thing, and then the last thing I want to say to this, that when I made the report on human remains from colonial context in Berlin, it is in a lot of institutions that there are human remains where you will not find from more about the provenance. So there is bones left alone, or this question, and there was from the people responsible in the institution, there was also this wish to have more debate on this and rethink this also. Maybe this could also be, for example, if there's an advisory board to speak about this topic with people from different places, what can be solutions for this? And for example, now in an art university in Berlin, they are also thinking about what to do with their skeletons. They have there to paint also. And they want to and there's also now this wish to rehumanize them, to make them not just leave them in the storage room, but also to deal in a more in a better way for them with this human remains. And this is a question. I think this is almost in all collections, that there will be some human remains where you don't know from where they come from, and there's also, like in the indigenous communities, also there's a question of how to deal now with this and how to rebury them. There was, for example, in the last week there was also in one school, they've also buried a skeleton from the biology classroom, and they made a inter-religious bury. So I think this creativity is everywhere to look of how to deal with it.
So we have one question online.
Yeah. So there's another question on Zoom from Nina Jans. although I'm not entirely sure whether she's referring to a specific case that one of you mentioned or whether it's just a general question. So she writes, were the remains treated differently because of the deeds of the deceased? Is it known what the deceased did while alive? But maybe you can take this as a general question and think of cases that you know where this made a difference.
I only know from the collection, Liv also has talked about that there's also a lot of, there's also some human remains from Germany, for example, and often there's written how they died. So, for example, there was Kindsmörderin, so somebody, a woman who killed her child. So this, or for example, criminal also, because a lot of the human remains for anthropological, for medical treatment also came from the prisons and from the hospitals, and also psychiatries, kind of. So in this remains, there's sometimes you can find this information on the directly on the category.
But there's also a lot of robbery in burial, and there's no information about the life of the person.
I can say something about this quickly. We've already some smiles. Obviously, with Lenin, we do know what he did. He did the revolution. And if you read the discussions of the revolutionary leaders, and the discussions went on for 2.5 months before he was embalmed. There are all sorts of interesting reasons why they were able to discuss it for so long before they either buried or not buried the body, because it was very cold in Moscow at that time, like -27 to -22 for 2 months. It was very cold winter. And also the body was embalmed temporarily, as often is the case for the wake, for the public farewell. And that temporary embalming was quite, I mean, it was only temporary, but nevertheless it helped to maintain it for 2 months. So if you read those discussions which went on for 2 months, then how they treated the remains indeed was very much affected by what they thought Lenin represented, what he did. What they wanted ultimately, I think the most important thing about why they embalmed it, they want something radically different from everything which ever existed. They wanted to bury Lenin in such a way that never really existed before. So this kind of radical newness was very important for them, because they really imagined the world as becoming radically new as a result of that big rupture which the revolution for them represented. So here it's a very direct example of how human remains are treated in a particular way, precisely because of what the person did and what he represents to that group.
I have 2 questions. So one, you mentioned rehumanization, particularly with maybe like the art class example, right? Or maybe it's a biology class where you don't specifically know who the body belonged to and no one's asking about it. Are there options for rehumanization beyond just, we're going to bury this person? Like, are there ways to not lock them up in a storage facility, but still provide some humanity back to the specimen that could still allow them to be used if they're not contested or being asked for? And the next question is, because the topic is so heated, do institutions now typically just avoid collecting these types of specimens in the first place? Because maybe even if consent is given, it's not given indefinitely. Those are my questions. I don't know to who they should go.
I can speak on the strategies for humanization. One thing that I've heard, for example, is that osteologists who study human remains talk throughout their study with the person that they're studying as a way of reminding themselves and the person that they're recognizing their humanity. And I guess this is something that you can probably also find in some medical ethics. people talking or relating to the body that they are dissecting, for example, recognizing their humanity. And we can see those kinds of strategies being employed also in biological anthropology today. Not that everybody does it and not that it's taught broadly, but I think it's something that should maybe be introduced more intentionally, because I think it's a great way to recognize the humanity, even if when you are studying bones. Anybody else? What was your other question? Since there's the second question.
Sure. The second question was: are institutions now tending to avoid collecting these types of human remains because it can become such a contested and challenging act to repatriate them? So just avoiding them in the first place is the better course of action.
I think that happens. It happens a lot right now. I know in Sweden, where I hear a lot of schools and kind of relatives of dead physicians and dentists who have human remains in their house, or schools that have these school teaching skeletons, that they turn to museums because they think about museums as a kind of place where that will take proper responsibility of these. And the museums say, like, thanks but no thanks. Like, we do not want this. Like, there's no connection. Like, we have enough to deal with the collections that we already have in our possession. So that becomes an issue, actually. What happens to them? And I think when it comes to archaeological human remains, it's a little bit different. That is the bulk today. There is not a whole lot of anatomy collections are no longer really used anymore, and so on. But for medical research, but they're used for medical history research, obviously. But they don't really, I think, get collected in the same way. But archaeology is the archaeology that results in a lot of human remains being unearthed is for the great majority prompted by development. So if you want to build a road or a school or something, you will disturb those burials, and then archaeology will register, document, and collect the archaeological remains, including the human remains, from that site. So then the question maybe should be asked, do you want the school or the hospital or the parking lot or the railway there or not? Because if you do, it's going to result in this kind of activity.
One quick question. I'm thinking about the word decolonization, and my question is if you had any examples, if you had any experience in museum that decolonization also could mean that particular ethnic minorities from the states are reclaiming for objects, or Roma, Sinti, for instance, or Yiddish culture, for instance, in Europe, in, for instance, Holocaust Museum, what then? Or what about ethnic minority, for instance, in Sweden, claiming the colonial processes? If there is any, we are talking also about Aleksei, or political aspects, which is also important for decolonization. If there is a risk, if you find it as a risk, that decolonization could mean that, there will be many claims about objects in the state, and you open the doors for constant decolonization processes, which will be about replacing the objects for ideas and making the space more non-material than material in the end. What I like, being honest, also thinking from post-humanistic point of view, very much. But it's a question, about what kind of decolonization we are talking about, because for sure we are not talking about non-European decolonization process. And what is the idea of museum for the future? Is a rather preventive perspective, or very open, post-global, post-humanistic, post-decolonial perspective. This is the design thinking, but this is a question we are going to be forced very soon. If we are talking about really deeply and seriously about decolonization processes. Thank you.
Maybe for the German context, I think the debate about human remains from in the context of the Nationalsozialismus, like the NS context, is something which was more aware before, more sensitivity. So the sensitivity went over also to this kind of decolonial questions. But still, I think it's really very interesting. For example, in the now there's a project for the Kaiser Wilhelm Institut für Anthropologie in Berlin. This is a research institute that were in the 20s and during the time of the Third Reich. I'm sorry, Third Reich. And they made research also on Jews, Sinti and Roma, also disabled people, very different people. And there they have an advisory board also from organizations from these different groups coming also together now to discuss. And there were 60,000 fragments of human remains found in this place when there was construction work. And first it was discussed with Sinti, dem Zentralrat von Sinti und Roma und jüdischen Zentralrat, oder der Zentralrat der Juden in Deutschland. And then after a while also there was this criticism that it could be also from colonial times. And then there was also the question who to ask, who to involve also in this debate. So there is this situations where this different contexts also mix, and where human remains from also different times and contexts are together. And it's not always maybe the very easy also, because sometimes also interests are not the same. So for example, in the case of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, the Zentralrat der Juden in Deutschland und für Sinti und Roma, they said they don't want that more research is conducted on this human remains. And and in other instances, maybe people want more research to really track the colonial context. And so I think this is one question.
For Sweden, Sweden is not a precursor in any way when it comes to these things, but there are definitely things happening, and in particular recognizing Nordic colonialism and recognizing the colonialism of the Swedish state, particularly with regards to Sápmi. So that's definitely a big debate. There's also cases about a hot debated case of a collection of human crania from Finland right now that I'm aware of. There are cases of reburied Jewish man, or the cranium of a Jewish man from an anatomical collection. So there are like bits and pieces. I believe that but there is no, in Sweden, I think that there is no distinction made right now anymore, at least between the minorities within Sweden and a colonial history outside of Sweden, or these other anatomical collections of trade and, so I think that that's happening kind of according now to the same principles and considerations and definitions. Whether this will result in the transfer of materiality out of storage rooms and replacing them with non-tangible Heritage. I think it's hard to overestimate how much is in museum storages, including human remains. So when we look at what has happened in the United States, which has had a pretty strict, clear law regulating repatriation for 30 years now, they have, I think, repatriated about 30% or something like that. I might be wrong, but like it's not. It kind of is not. It never. These processes, in general, don't end up repatriating and returning everything, and most of the time it's because it's really difficult to establish affiliation properly. And so then that goes back to the responsibility of museums and the difficulty of these often fragmented histories. We have a big anatomical, or not a big, a smaller sized anatomical collection in Karolinska Institutet in Stockholm. It burned in the 19th century, and part of the things that burned were the archives. So even if there would be a will to return most of it, there are limits to what can be done. Yeah.
And can I also answer? Yes, I keep interrupting you. So I wanted to basically address the broadest part of your question, Mokashat, about what kind of decolonial are we thinking about, where does it end, or what kind of parameters we're thinking about. And I think, in the broadest sense of the word, kind of like what we spoke about before, decolonial, of course, is thought of as a figure in relation to colonial. And colonialism tends to be thought of as a Western project, as a project, to be more precise, of Western bourgeois democracy, or not even democracy, bourgeois state, right? Kind of modernizing global capitalism. And within that framework, when we think about the colonial, for example, in the former communist world, where this term is used very widely and rightly so, I think there is a problem because we equate then Soviet colonialism with British colonialism. And that's a real problem because part of the impulse of the communist project was very anti-colonial one. It doesn't make it a really anti-colonial project. It had a lot of colonialism in it, but what kind of colonialism it is, which is mixed with this anti-colonial, anti-global colonialism actually move, we need to think about, right? So to simply apply this decolonial as the best colonial West, and we can apply it in every single context, and then our decolonial is the global North response to those who are colonized, I think is a problem. Again, I'm returning to the situation we're having now in Russia, Ukraine, to understand and to decolonize those relations, to think about them historically. We need actually a much more robust concept of decolonial, which is not limited to the Western colonialism, and which is not necessarily, maybe even decolonial is not the right term. Because as I said again, we should not forget the communist project was to a large extent very anti-colonial project, even if in practice it often colonized. Yeah.
So may take one last question and then.
I was wondering, for me it's not only a colonial topic if we speak about the dignity of the dead. For example, if we think about museums like the Ötzi Museum, there is a large fascination for us as visitors to view these artifacts. And also I think it's a chance for us as a society to find an access to our own mortality, to the fact that we all are going to die. And the question to you all, what do you think is the role of museums to educate us as human beings and society about the delicate topic of death?
I was thinking of the title of the conference that it was quite paradoxical because the notion of dignity is precisely what survives death. There's a Latin quote in the Middle Ages saying dignitas non moritur, so that the king survives the king's body, and that is dignitas. So in a way, museums are giving a second life to the dead, which is a way to make them dignified. But, so this is a provocation to think for the future days, and this roundtable was a teaser for the conference, so you're very welcome to join, and I think we can end there and thank our speakers for the very stimulating discussion.
Thank you, Frédéric, for chairing it, and I'm really happy with this discussion because in a very short time span, you mentioned so many of the themes that we're going to be talking about tomorrow and on Saturday. And I was really intrigued by the way that Lenin actually shed light on, colonial, decolonial, post-colonial context. And there was a very interesting and, I think, unexpected series of echoes between that case and the other cases that we were talking about. Everyone who is physically, bodily present at the Einstein Forum is very welcome now to join us in continuing the discussion informally over a glass of wine. Everyone else, we will welcome back on Zoom or maybe physically here in Potsdam tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Before we all depart, I just want to draw your attention, once again, those of you who are present here in Potsdam, to the exhibition that is surrounding you. This is an exhibition of photographs by Taras Bychko, a photographer from Lviv in Ukraine, which was curated for us by Pavlo Kovac, also based in Lviv, artist and curator, and that we are displaying, among other things, in a sign of solidarity with Ukraine. If you're interested in learning more about these photos, which are part of an exhibition called In Search of Light, then you can pick up a leaflet with a statement by the artist. And with that, thank you all very much. Let's have some wine and continue tomorrow morning.